I have discovered that PA people cannot help me if I fail to turn on a mic. Also, we have run out of our 10-part DVDs. And so, the unfortunate thing is, if any of you want those, you're going to have to get them from our website, islamandchristianity.org. And so, there are other materials out there, but not that one. All right? So we're looking at the role of Islam in this growing conflict. There, I wanted to pass that one. Let's get into that. How many of you are here for the first time tonight? Quite a few hands. For that reason, I'm going to give a brief overview. All right? Daniel 11, that's the chapter we're looking at, has a series of powers that invade Israel from the north. Thus, you have a king of the north and a king of the south in Daniel 11. Whenever they're both there, it identifies them in north and south, as north and south. Other than that, when the south isn't there, it just talks about him as he all the way through. It's about the king of the north, but once in a while there's a king of the south. And here's what happens. In Daniel's writings, we have Babylon that invades Israel from the north. Jeremiah called them a kingdom of the north because they invaded from the north. They went up the Euphrates River and dropped down from the north because that's a desert in between and it's water over here. You're either going to invade Israel from the north or from the south. Thus you have a king of the north and a king of the south. So let me illustrate it here with this little slide. Babylon, there to the east. If you go through the desert, you cook your army. Not good. So you go up the valley where you have water for your animals and all that, and drop down from the north. So Babylon was the king of the north. Also, the Medes and the Persians are called the king of the north in Daniel, they are in Daniel. They come in from the north, and Jeremiah calls them a kingdom from the north. The Greeks, Alexander the Great, invades Israel from the north. Then the Greek Empire splits 4 ways in the different prophecies of Daniel, but in 11 he only cares about 2 of them, north and south. Seleucid north, Ptolemy south. God's people get caught in the middle. So does Jerusalem. Then the Roman Empire comes in from the north. The Roman Empire divides multiple ways, but it settles into 2 major pieces. Christian north, Islamic south. Can anybody tell me what city gets caught in the middle? It's always about Jerusalem getting caught there. But we've already found as well, and I illustrated in the last, really from the time of Christ onward, that's verse 22. From 23 onward, this is an acted out parable, if you would. Whatever happens to Israel in Jerusalem is happening to God's people, his Israel of faith, his new covenant believers all over the world. And so everything in Daniel 11 from 23 onward has a geopolitical, you can see it on a map, but it has a worldwide global religious application as well. Now, there are 3 conflicts between the time of Rome and the end of time, between the north and the south, between papal-led Christianity and violent forms of Islam. You had the Crusades, Arab Islam, Ottoman Islam, the Turks, and the time of the end with the radical Islam today. Now, lots of people have asked me, do we have the Christians and the Muslims worshiping the same God? Well, don't ever answer that with a yes or no if somebody asks you the question, because you will be digging yourself into trouble. Here's your answer. Jesus said that his true followers would love their enemies and do good to those who persecute them. So was it the jihadists during the Crusades or the Crusaders during the Crusades that loved their enemies and did good to the other side? Neither one did. So here's your answer. There are many Muslims and many Christians that are serving the same false god of force, fear, and anger, coercion. Do it our way or else. There are some Christians and some Muslims who have found or are in search of the same true God of love, truth, peace, and forgiveness. And tonight, it is my goal to show you that from the text. All right? So let's take a look at what is the role of Islam. In Daniel 11, 40 to 43, the third and final conflict. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand. Interesting, this is when the Daniel 11 king of the south, Islam, goes down. Look what countries get named. Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon, that's western Jordan today. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also, the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. I want you to notice something. We have western Jordan, Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. All right? And when we're talking Ethiopia, we're talking Daniel's Ethiopia that includes the Sudan and Somalia and places like that. And when you take all that into consideration, all these areas are predominantly Muslim. So when the king of the south goes down, he names Muslim areas. Now there's a three-way split. They don't all go down the same way. All right? One of them is really, really good. But we'll get into that. So let's take a look at the history. Arab Islam under Muhammad starts down here in Mecca and Medina, the southern part of the Roman Empire. He receives his visions or his understanding in 612. By 634, he's dead and gone. However, that year, 4 Muslim armies sweep up out of the Saudi Arabia Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula. One of them goes to the west of Jerusalem. 3 of them go to the east. They come up here, conquer this territory, and then in 637 come down to take Jerusalem. If you are familiar with World War II, the U.S. had an island hopping campaign. They didn't fight for every island. They'd skip several of them and just leave the Japanese to starve out, basically, as their supply lines fell apart. That's what they were doing to Jerusalem. They knew it would be a really, really bad fight to take the city of Jerusalem because the Byzantine Christians that held Jerusalem were well fortified. So they said, let's just leave them alone. They went up here, took all this territory, then they came back and surrounded Jerusalem. And the Byzantine soldiers knew they didn't really have a chance. There was no rescue that would be coming. And so they negotiated terms to surrender. But they said they would only surrender to Omar. Omar was the caliph. Have you ever heard of the term a caliphate or a caliph? You see, a caliphate and a caliph is a lot like a pope. The pope has political and religious power in the Christian world, right? And a caliph has both political and religious power in the Muslim world. And they both believe that someday they will control the world. I will just tell you that every time there's been a caliphate, there's been a holy war. Because there's not enough room for 2 leaders that both intend to control the whole world, religiously and politically. So far, every time we have a caliphate, we have a holy war. So these soldiers were surrounding Jerusalem, and they would surrender to Omar, the caliph. Omar's down here. And so there's a general by the name of Khalid, a really, really wise Muslim general. But he looked a lot like Omar. And he said, hey guys, dress me up like Omar, I'll pretend to be the caliph, and they'll surrender, and we don't have to wait for Omar to come up from Medina. And so they dress him up, and he comes up in a big parade, and he's coming in, expecting the gates to open, and they're going to surrender. And somebody on the wall is looking down and said, "Hey, I know Khalid. That's Khalid. It's not Omar." There went that one. They had to wait for Omar to show up from Medina before Jerusalem surrendered. So here's what's important about that. Is Islam the king of the south or the king of the north? In Daniel, it's where your first hit comes from. So on that one, they first came from the south. That means they are now the king of the south. However, they went up here, and they didn't take Jerusalem until they came from the north. Make it a bit confusing, right? However, Jerusalem surrenders when Omar, the true king of the south, comes up from the south. So this ties it in. Omar, or the caliph, is the king of the south. It's just kind of interesting. It's like Satan knew the prophecy and he tried to mess it up. But somebody on the wall says, "That's not Omar, it's Khalid." And it works out. Now, if you look at the world map today, these areas in red are areas that the Muslims claim to be their territory. Now, I have presented in Nigeria, and I know a lot of Nigerians that would not accept that Nigeria is Muslim. But my point here is that if you take a look at this Muslim crescent shape, it's still, after 14 centuries of conflict, it's still basically to the south of Israel, isn't it? The other point is this. There's Turkey. I have it striped, somewhat schizophrenic. Why? It's politically aligned with NATO, the Christian world. It's religiously aligned with the Muslim world. That worked okay under Ataturk. But Erdogan now wants to be a caliph himself and run a world caliphate. It's getting a little more dicey. But the Christian world up here is still basically to the north. And, the papacy, when he called for the Crusades, they came in from the north. So that gives you the north and the south lay. Charles Malik was a Lebanese politician, president of the United Nations General Assembly, and he was an ambassador to the U.S. from Lebanon. Lecturing at Harvard, he said the following: "The only hope for the Western world lies in an alliance between the Roman Catholic Church, which is the most commonly influential, controlling, unifying element in Europe, and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Rome must unite with Eastern Orthodoxy because the Eastern Orthodox Church controls the Western Middle East. And if they don't solidify that control, Islam will march across Europe. Islam is political. The only hope of the Western world lies then in a united Europe under the control of the Pope." He knows, as a politician that knows his history, that the papacy is the organizer of the 2 times the spread of Islam was checked. He's Orthodox Christian. He is not Catholic. But he says the only hope of the Western world lies then in a united Europe under the control of the Pope. He goes on to say this: "And then all Protestant Christians around the globe must come into submission to the Pope, so we will have a unified Christian world." And that's exactly what I believe the prophecy is pointing us at. That's where it's headed. Why does he want the world to unify behind the Pope? Because he knows that during the Turkish Empire, because the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church didn't unite, the Turks almost took the whole thing. This time he's saying unite faster. That's still a setup for a holy war. Now, we have the king of the north, which is the same as the little horn, etc., in Scripture. King of the north. We have the king of the south. Now, some people would call that Antichrist, but the thing is, the term Antichrist in the Bible says there are many Antichrist, not just one. All right? And the term Antichrist actually means either in place of Christ or against Christ. And there are Christians who put leaders in place of Christ. There are Catholic documents that say the Pope is in place of Christ. There are Muslims who deny the divinity of Christ. One is in place of, the other is against. It's just interesting. When I look at the prophecies, both North and South fulfill much of them. The thing of it is, the 15 characteristics we looked at on presentation 2, they meet the papal system, not Catholic people, many of which are God's people. All right? The king of the South, Islam, matches about 3/4 of them. It's amazing how similar they are in many ways. They persecute the saints. Well, if you take a look at the papal system, during this time period, they killed Muslims, Jews, and Christians who differed with them. But if you look at the jihadists, they killed Christians, Jews, and Muslims who differed with them. There's a lot of similarity there, isn't there? Also, it talks about receiving the dragon seat, or the capital of Rome. Well, the papacy gets the city of Rome, which was the capital of Rome. But hold up. There was a second Roman capital, wasn't there? It was known as Constantinople, now Istanbul, which became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the Caliphate, for over 400 years. Oh, one gets one capital, the other gets the other. It's amazing how it works out. There are time prophecies for both, the 1260 times and half a time, or 1260 days, from 538 to 1798 for the king of the north. But Arab Islam, Revelation 9 has a time prophecy, 5 months or 150 days, a day for a year, gives you 150 years. And it fits the Arab Islamic push. Then it goes on to talk about a second one in Revelation 9, verse 15. That one comes out to 391 years and 15 days. A guy by the name of Josiah Litch in the late 1830s says, sometime in 1840, I believe the Ottoman Empire is going to fall apart. Early 1840, he says, well, I can be more specific. And he writes it down in a book. He said, I actually believe it will be August 11, 1840. And on August 11, 1840, in events in Turkey, Lebanon, and Egypt, the Ottoman Empire becomes a protectorate of the Allied powers. Now, I know it doesn't pass out of existence till the end of World War I. However, in Bible prophecy, whenever a power becomes subservient, it is no longer the superpower. And that did happen in 1840. And so that fit as well. So we have time prophecies for both. Those two were the first two woes. But interesting, after talking about the first woe, Revelation 9, it said, one woe is past, behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things. Those woes were Islam-Christian conflicts. 3 of them. It doesn't clearly explain the third woe in Revelation. Daniel has 3 conflicts between the north and the south, and it clearly explains the third one. They're both conflicts between the Christian world and the Muslim world in holy wars. So in the Arab phase, they came and took this area, and the Pope called for holy war, and the Christian nations, because they were afraid of Islam, came in on the Crusades. Second phase, 29 to 39, deals with both the Reformation and the Ottoman Empire. It says, at the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. And then it tells us why. Well, in the first one, the papacy gets control of the Christian world. Papal-led Christianity gets control of Jerusalem for a while. Second one, they never do. Third one, they predict that they will have it again. So the first and the third, papal-led Christianity gets Jerusalem. Second one, they go that way, but they're blocked. And then it tells us why in verse 30. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and shall regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So he's going to head south in the second conflict. but he's going to be stopped from ships from Cyprus and return angry and go against the covenant. All right? You can find it in history. That's exactly what happens. 1571 is the Battle of Otranto during the Venetian-Ottoman War. The Pope is concerned. The Muslims have been pushing up into Europe, and they then decide to go back and attack Cyprus, where the Christians have a fortress so that their fleets can operate out here and protect people who are going to Jerusalem. Even though Jerusalem was controlled by Muslims, many Christians still went there to the Holy Land. And that was under attack. So the Pope calls for what is known as the Holy League, and the nations of Europe put together somewhere around 300 ships. And these are heavily manned because they all have the oars, the galley ships. The Turks know what's coming. They are aware of it. They get their fleet rolling first. They sail out to Cyprus with about 300 ships. Where did it say those ships were going to come from to stop them? From Cyprus. Oops, didn't mean to push that button. So, the Turks get here. They finish off the Christian forces. The last fortress to fall, the commander negotiated a surrender that would allow his troops to get on a ship and sail away. They surrendered. The Turks came in, locked them up, took the commander out, tied him to a post, cut off his nose, cut off his ears, and then skinned him alive. And then they killed the rest of his men. The Christians were furious. But then again, the Christians had done some similar things in the Crusades. But they were really mad now. And after finishing off Cyprus, the Muslim fleet headed west to meet the Christian fleet. And the fleets met right about here in the Battle of Otranto. In about 4 hours that day, over 50,000 men died from both sides. Combination from both sides. About 50,000 men died. The Muslim fleet was decimated. The Christian fleet was so badly damaged that it turned around and sailed home. Their goal was to take Cyprus and then Jerusalem. But they got stopped by ships from Cyprus, just like the prophecy said. But the rest of the prophecy says they're now going to go back home and cause trouble for the covenant. Well, right away after the Battle of Lepanto, the Pope has this picture painted. This is the Muslim fleet, this is the Christian fleet. You can tell the Muslim side lost. They've got skeletons over there. So this is in the Vatican. Beside it, there was an area that the Pope was expecting to have a picture when they went back and conquered Cyprus, and another one for Jerusalem to celebrate that. Except it didn't happen. And the next year, another picture was put up. Pope Gregory the Great commissioned this painting in 1572 of what happened after the Battle of Lepanto. And there's a second one that goes up as well. This is a picture depicting the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre when in a few days, starting on St. Bartholomew's Day, over 70,000 Huguenots were killed. They'd been given safe passage to come to a special event, and then it was revoked without them knowing about it, and they were killed. They had disagreed over several things spiritually with the system and were considered heretics. And that's what went up in place of Cyprus and Jerusalem victories. The prophecy was the king of the north will head south. He will be stopped by ships from Cyprus and return and go against the covenant. The Huguenots believed in the Bible and the common languages. And for that, they were killed. But why does God allow the Islamic invasions? You don't have to guess. The Bible's very clear. It says so, what it is. But the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands. They should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, or wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. You see, in the Old Testament times, whenever the Israelites started putting up images, especially images in the temple, did they gain or lose protection from God? They always lost protection, right? And so often when the Israelites lost protection, it was Edomites, Moabites, Babylonians, people like that, right? Do you realize Abraham was from where? Babylon, or the Chaldees. And Edom, Moab, and Ammon, these are all related to the Abrahamic family. God sends Abrahamic family members in to discipline Israel when they get out of line. Well, the church starts putting up images in the church. Oh, I know. They claim they're not worshiping them. They're worshiping what they represent. But the golden calf, they said, represented the God who led them out of Egypt, and God wasn't so thrilled with that. He said not to bow down before images. And so when Christians start bowing down before images, in come the Muslims, which connect themselves with who? Ishmael, a son of Abraham. And what does Muhammad and his followers really hate? Probably more than almost anything else, is image worship. It's interesting. That's what God said it was about. So we've got people say, is one of these sides all bad and the other all good? No, they both have good, they both have bad in them. They also were both kind of bloody. Now let me illustrate this. During the Ottomans, the Reformation starts, and there's a German monk up here by the name of Luther. Now, the Pope didn't like him too well. I don't think he liked the Pope too well either. But what kept the Pope from going up here and eliminating him? It's really pretty simple. There were a few princes with small armies up there that were protecting him. So to take him out, you've got to take a larger army up there, and you are going to have a civil war that you cannot afford to do because the Turks are pushing in, and you need those guys and everybody else to gather to stop the Turks. And so one day, somebody asked Martin Luther how he was protected. And he said his greatest defender was the Sultan of Turkey, the Caliph. How's that? Every time they were getting ready to come after Martin Luther, the Turks pushed in. And they never could afford to have the little civil war up there that it would take to get Martin Luther. And so he viewed the Muslims as his protector. Not that they liked each other so much, but their actions protected him. Now get this. Because of the push of the Muslims, righteousness by faith came out in the open in the Reformation, and the Bible in the common languages. The system was unable to stop it because of the Turks pushing from the south. It's interesting how God uses everything for good. Now, 3 conflicts in Revelation 9, the 3 woes, 3 conflicts in Daniel 11. At the appointed time he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. This next little piece is probably going to blow right by a whole lot of you. My wife calls it the graduate level. The appointed time. I'm going to explain it Saturday morning in what they call Sabbath school here. It deals with the 1290 and the 1335 of Daniel 12. The appointed time. There's a prophecy in Daniel 12 that says from the abomination of desolation will be 1290 and 1335 to a blessing, basically, all right? In Daniel's writings, there are 2 abominations of desolation. One in Daniel 9, which is the fall of Jerusalem, and the other one in Daniel 11:31, mentions it right after the Battle of Lepanto, mentions that. So here's what you have. 70 AD, you go 1,290 years, it brings us to Wycliffe, the theoretician of the Reformation. 1335 brings us to John Huss, the first practicing reformer. And with that, you have the beginning of the appointed time, the beginning of the Reformation, all right? Because 29 to 39 deals with the Reformation in the Turks. You have a second starting point in Daniel 11:31, which is when the papacy receives the force of arms. That's 508, when the French King Clovis gives military power over to the papacy to take out the Arians. And it begins the process that terminates under Justinian, wiping out the Arians. But from 508 onwards, 1,290 years brings you to 1798, when the papacy lost its ability to persecute people. And then on 1335 to 1843-44, and we'll take a look at that in a later meeting and how that ends up being the time of the end. But get this for tonight. Between 1360 and 1405, both the Reformation and the Ottoman Empire are gaining power. From this time to 1798, they're strong, and then they go down during this time. Both of them have a power curve that rises and falls during this time period. Before the appointed time, you have the Crusades and Arab Islam. After the appointed time, you have the time of the end with radical Islam at the end. I'm going to explain all that in detail Saturday morning, which I think is 9:30 here in what they call Sabbath school. Is that correct? 9:30? Okay, they're nodding their heads, some of the members here, so got it. If you want to get that, you can. Now, also, the King of the North, the papal system, according to Revelation 13, called the beast, comes back with great power after receiving a deadly wound, which it got in 1798. Now I want to show you something. Here's a papal power curve. 538 to 1798. They were strong. That's when they had both church and state power. They received military support just 30 years earlier, but they became church and state strong from Justinian's decree being implemented until 1798. They're weak. 1929, they get Mussolini gives them the Vatican back, and with that concordat, and they gain power, and they will reach their height of power shortly before Jesus sets up his kingdom. That's papal power. King of the North. Now look at King of the South. Arab Islam, and then they weaken in the Crusades, and Ottomans come back and push against them. Then they come down, and then they come back up. And we have the third conflict, and we're in that one now, I believe. And we'll illustrate that more. And so, notice how similar the King of the North and the King of the South are in their power curves. They track side by side. It's interesting to watch. So, could we have a war with the Christian, papal-led Christianity with the U.S. and their allies with the papacy against radical Islam? Could that actually happen? Well, if you've been watching the world events, you know it's basically in progress. If you understand the end-time views of Muslims, at least some Muslims, I should say, you understand how almost unavoidable this is. We have radicals, Sunni and Shiite. They have something in common. The radicals all want to have a world capital of Islam in the city of Al-Quds. They believe Jesus will actually take down an evil character in that area at the time of the end. Sunnis believe a war in Syria, the Sunni radicals believe a war in Syria starts this out, and it will go into world chaos, and God will then save the Muslims, and they will force the world to become Muslim. Shiite Muslims believe there's going to be a war in Syria, and it will cause chaos, but a 12th Imam will come on the scene and will lead the Muslim world, and God will deliver them, and the whole world will end up Muslim. So, if you understand that, you realize the radical sides aren't going to stop for a while. This was an interesting one from World Watch Today in 2012. Muhammad Badia, the Muslim Brotherhood's supreme guide, confirmed the necessity for every Muslim to strive to save Al-Quds from the hands of the rapist and to cleanse Palestine from the clutches of the occupation, deeming that this is an individual duty for all Muslims. He is the Brotherhood's supreme spiritual guide. In 1920, the Muslim Brotherhood was established in Egypt. And from that, all radical Islam comes from the Muslim Brotherhood, today's radical Muslims. They all trace their roots back into that. So, it's interesting, the Egyptian Brotherhood is the beginning of modern radical Islam, and in Daniel 11, it says Egypt goes down. There is a tie, but let's keep going. Iranian-Syrian crisis, prelude to the coming of the Mahdi. So, Badia is a Sunni. Now we're looking at a Shiite view. A high Iranian politician believes the Syrian revolution could be the catalyst for sparking a worldwide conflagration that will usher in an era of Muslim domination of the world. So they're looking at that in Syria to be that. Now Mary, there was a book, Thunder of Justice, that was a list of prophecies that were supposed to be filled about the year 2000, or right at 2000, and supposedly predictions from Mary, but most of them failed. Jesus did not come in 2000. This was not an official book of the Catholic Church. This was a group of lay Catholics put this book together, all right, just to be clear. In that book, there's this quote: "There will be a World War III, and it will be started by a man who wears the turban of the faith, a Muslim. Yet there's a more powerful one to rise in Syria. When this one has accomplished his work, he will cause destruction and pain and great persecution. The red will flow into the sea. There will be nothing to eat. The Antichrist is going to arise from the Mohammedan race, a Muslim. He's going to have a turban. The people will call it the Eye of Satan. He will be young and wearing a long robe. He will be very intelligent, well-equipped for nuclear war, worse than Hitler, connected with communists, fire rockets at us, and some will hit New York City." Well, in 2001, something did hit in New York City. But I want you to notice something. We have Badia, a Sunni, looking for a holy war. We have the Shiites looking for a holy war. And we have visions from Mary expecting a holy war. Do you get an idea something might be coming? Now, many evangelicals are teaching that the Antichrist will be a Muslim. You see, the evangelicals and Protestants, Luther, Calvin, and all the rest, used to say it was the papal system, not the people, but the system. Then it moved to it was just some political power out of Europe, and now it's moved again, and they're saying, oh, it's going to be a Muslim. But just remember, a holy war is when both sides look at the other and say they're of the devil. So the Muslims are looking at the Christian world and saying they're all infidels. Jihad, kill them. The radical Muslims are saying that. And they are. And you've got Christians that are saying, oh, the Muslim leader is the Antichrist. They're of the devil. Can you not see where this is headed? It's headed into a holy war. That's all holy war language. And a holy war is the most unholy of all wars because both sides act like the devil in the name of God. God's people are supposed to be loving their enemies, not using force and fear and intimidation. Well, so we're looking at, in Daniel 11:40-43, the king of the north is attacked by the king of the south. I believe that's Islam attacking papal-led Christianity with the U.S. involved. That was presentation 3 and how the U.S. is involved. And then the papal-led Christianity counterattacks Palestine or Israel, and Islam gets divided 3 ways. Let's look at it. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. So Islam comes up against the king of the north. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, Israel, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand. Okay, we got somebody escaping, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. That's where the brotherhood starts from. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. They follow the king of the north. So let's take a look at this. One part escapes. I'm going to set them aside. We're going to look at them at the end because they're the good news piece of this. I like ending with good news. All right? The second part, Egypt in many countries is overthrown. And the third, we have Libya and Ethiopia following after, and the parallel is Revelation 13:3, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Now, let's take a look. Egypt. It says Egypt in many countries go down. Egypt is the birthplace of modern radical Islam. Now notice, I already laid down a principle that after the cross, verse 22, everything after that is geopolitical. You can see it on the map, but it's also applies globally. Every of these place names applies in that way. God's Israel, the land of Israel, it's on the map, but God's Israel, his people, are everyone new covenant believers that trust in him. Ephesians 2, if you want to check it. All right, so Egypt, on the map, is going to be overthrown. So I expect Egypt will radicalize. And friends, it's right on the edge of it right now. The last free election was won by the Muslim Brotherhood and a military coup threw them out. Boudia, the guy I quoted from a bit ago, has been in prison ever since that coup. So I expect Egypt itself as a country, the radicalizing go down, but it also represents radical Islam all over the world that goes down. Libya and Ethiopia, these are the territories that they represented when Daniel was alive. And I expect that Libya and Ethiopia will say, hey, we don't like radical Islam either. We'll join you. And friends, most Muslims don't like radical Islam. Radical Islam has killed more Muslims than anything else. Now, I've been in quite a few mosques and talking with them. And they say, oh, please, don't even call these people radical Muslims. Call them terrorists, call them killers. Don't call them radical Muslims. We don't want to be affiliated with them. I said, well, they claim to be true Islam, true Muslims. So I will call them radicalized Muslims. They don't like that, but that's just going by what the radicals call themselves, all right? Now, if Egypt goes down in many countries, since it's not this territory and not this territory, it's going to be out in here. Many of them go down. Just think for a moment. If several countries go down in the Middle East, Egypt and many other countries, what's likely to happen to the shaky world economy? It's going to be one big challenge. So this whole thing gets dicey on many levels. Politically, militarily, energy-wise, financially. It's a challenging situation that we're looking at. Now, how might this happen? Let's take a look. In 2011, I wrote a book. In it, I had some expectations based on Daniel 11 that radical Islam would anger the papacy, papal-led Christianity. The papacy, the Pope, would call for war. He called for the Crusades, got it. He called for the Holy League and got it. So Daniel 11:40 should kick in when radical Islam pushes against the Pope and the Pope calls for war and gets it rapidly, like a whirlwind. That's where the U.S. and their allies would give military support. Radical Islam would be overthrown, moderates would follow papal-led Christianity, and there's a sixth one not on there. And the sixth one is that there would be some Muslims that followed Jesus in the Bible and join with some Christians who follow Jesus in the Bible. That's the part that escapes, and I'm going to end with that. July 1, 2014, the whole sequence began. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed leader of the Islamic State stretching across Iraq and Syria, has vowed to lead the conquest of Rome as he called on Muslims to immigrate to his new land to fight under its banner around the globe. Okay, Arab Caliphate, the Pope calls for war, gets it. It's called the Crusades. Ottoman Caliphate, the Pope calls for war, gets it. It's called the Holy League. All of a sudden, in 2014, for the first time since the Ottoman Empire, we had a functioning caliphate. And look what their goal, their target was. The first day of their existence, they said their target was Rome. Daniel 11 says, you have a king of the south, and he's going to push against the king of the north. Day one, they start. I couldn't make that kind of stuff up. I'm watching that happen. I'm going, wow, that's right in track with Daniel. 5.5 weeks later, the Pope called for war. I don't know how many of you knew he did it, but he did. August 7, 2014, Pope Francis appealed to world leaders on Thursday to help end the crisis in northern Iraq after a sweeping advance by radical Islamic State militants forced thousands of residents of Iraq's biggest Christian town to flee their homes. His Holiness addressed an urgent appeal to the international community to take action to end the humanitarian tragedy now underway. The next day, President Obama, America is coming to help. There was a whole article on it. I want you to notice something. These news stories are in date order. Daniel says it will be like a whirlwind. I'm going to let you see the whirlwind unfold. I'm not going to talk about every terrorist event. You're familiar with that. But most people don't see what's really happening. And based on expectations, the United States would be the military enforcer. Within 36 hours of the papal call for action, the United States began to bomb the Islamic Caliphate, the Islamic State, and had never hit it before. Pope calls for action, boom, it gets hit. 13th, still less than a week after the Pope's call for action, and many of the media were saying the U.S. just jumped the gun. The Pope wanted humanitarian action. He's the man of peace. He did not want military action. Well, the Pope sent out his ambassadors to make it clear he wanted military action. The Holy See's ambassador to the United Nations, Silvano Tomasi, this weekend supported U.S. airstrikes aimed at halting the advance of Sunni Islamic State militants, calling for intervention now before it's too late. While the Vatican vocally disapproved of the U.S.-led campaign in Iraq in 2003, and they did, and the 2013 plan for airstrikes on Syria, and they did, they were opposed to both of those, fearing both might make the situation worse for Christians on the ground. Fears of ethnic cleansing by Islamists has forced a policy change. Daniel 11 says, the king of the south will push against the king of the north, and the king of the north basically is pushed into war. That's exactly how it happens. And because the Pope was clearly endorsing military action, here's the response. ISIS wants to assassinate the Pope. What has been declared by the self-declared Islamic State is clear. They want to kill the Pope. The threats against the Pope are credible. The Pope has made himself a target by speaking out against human rights abuses committed against Christians in Syria and Iraq, as well as by his approval of attempts by the U.S. to try and roll back ISIL, Islamic State. So they target the Pope by saying they're out to conquer Rome. The Pope approves military action. Now they're going to kill the Pope for doing what they pushed him into. There's kind of interesting circular logic that goes on, and that's not new for the Middle East. That's constant. And so why would they want to kill the Pope? They want a worldwide holy war. The radicals do. The moderates don't. But the radicals really do want this worldwide holy war. And if they figure they could kill the Pope, boy, that would start it off really good. And you know it would. Jihadi John says to Obama, the dog of Rome. The Pope calls for war, the U.S. bites. That means the U.S. is the dog of Rome. Except in Revelation 13, I've already showed you why I see the United States as a military enforcer for the papacy. So what we're seeing is prophecy being fulfilled step by step right in front of your eyes, and I'd wager 80 to 90% of you didn't even notice. Jesus said that the 10 virgins, his people, would be sleeping. Only 5 of them would wake up healthy enough to make it in. Christians are really sleepy. It's time to get healthy in our trust with Jesus. All right? Then the Pope says it's wrong to equate Islam with violence. I agree with much of this statement. Pope Francis said that equating Islam with violence was wrong and called on Muslim leaders to issue a global condemnation of terrorism to help dispel the stereotype. You just can't say that all Muslims are terrorists, just as you can't say that all Christians are fundamentalist. We have our share of them, fundamentalist. All religions have these little groups. So he's out to make friends with moderate Muslims, which is what the prophecy says he's going to do. But I want you to notice what he said. He said, we've got a problem with a group of Muslims who are taking certain verses in the Quran very literally. Fundamentalist Muslims. He just called for war on them shortly before and backed up the U.S. strike on them and said, yes, that's what I wanted. But then he says, we have our share of them fundamentalists in the Christian world too. During the Reformation, anybody who wanted to follow the Bible as the authority, call it a fundamentalist if you want, was called a heretic and was persecuted by the system. Millions were. I just have this concern that right after the persecution of Islam in a holy war, he turns on those who are serious about following the Bible and the prophecy of Daniel 11. And in this statement, I think I see the possibility of it coming. Now, I might be a little sensitive because I know history and prophecy, but it seems pretty likely. Then the world united in Paris. Most of you would remember the Charlie Hebdo incidents when Charlie Hebdo, a satire magazine in France, ran some cartoons about Muhammad. And a couple of guys showed up at their headquarters and killed a bunch of people and then had a shootout at a deli. I believe it was 17 people died in total. How many of you remember that event? Right. Within 48 hours of that, a historic crowd of more than 1 million people, including more than 40 world leaders, jammed the streets on Sunday of Paris. Leaders often at odds, such as Ukrainian president and Russian foreign minister. Oh, they were actually fighting a hot war on the ground in the Ukraine at the moment. Israeli Netanyahu and Palestinian Mahmoud Abbas. Oh, the head of the Palestinian Authority and the head of Israel. They were all marching in that parade against terrorism. The interesting thing is, there was another terrorist attack that week that killed somewhere around 2,000 people the same week. How many of you know where that one was? Most of your hands went up about the 17. I'm talking 2,000 now. I saw one hand over here. Anybody know where it was? Boko Haram, Nigeria. Nigeria says the number of people who lost their lives in an assault by Boko Haram militants on the town of Baga last week was no more than 150. Just 150. That's the tenor of the article, okay? The defense ministry said this figure included many of the terrorists who had attacked the town in Borno State and faced resistance by troops. Local officials earlier estimated the number of deaths as many as 2,000. Nigeria has often been accused of underestimating casualty figures to downplay the threat of Boko Haram. Do you realize there have been several terrorist attacks in northern Nigeria in the last week? How many of you have heard of them? A couple of you have heard of those. It's an ongoing situation. It's been that way for years. The truth was, there was somewhere around 2,000, maybe more, that died. It took a few days before the troops even regained control of that area, let alone killed the guys that did it, like they said. It was such a bad deal that the president of Nigeria ran out of luck and was voted out of office. You see, his name was Good Luck Jonathan. I remember driving at a high rate of speed in a vehicle with tinted windows in northern Nigeria. It's not a friendly place. We were driving between 90 and 100 miles an hour on 2-lane roads with potholes and pedestrians. I was praying that we wouldn't kill anybody. I didn't want to die, but I really didn't want to feel guilty of somebody being killed with them trying to protect me. You see, it's harder to hit a speeding target. What do you do if a vehicle stops in front of you? You slow down, bump into it, push it out of the way, and keep going. You don't stop. That happened twice that day. Because they could just be stopping so you get shot. It's an interesting place. And we were driving along at a very fast clip. We went past a burned out, blown up mosque. And just before that, we'd gone by Our Lady of Peace Church, Catholic Church. And I saw this blown up mosque just, quarter mile away. And I said, hey, what happened to that mosque? He said, well, that was a Boko Haram radical mosque, and the locals got mad and blew it up. That's it. And I just saw this. It was a large Catholic church. And I said, do I get this right? The Lady of Peace members blew up the mosque. And he said, yeah, that's it. He didn't get the interest in my question. But as we were driving along a bit later, I saw this huge picture, big man, big grin on his face, and it says, good luck, Jonathan. I turned to the driver, well, he's in front of me, and I said, so why are they wishing him good luck? And they both started laughing at me, the two black guys in the front. By the way, when you put your life in the handler's hands, you do what they say, because your life and their life are tied together. If they go down, I go down, I go down, they go down, kind of thing. And they both started laughing. And they said, good luck, Jonathan is the name of our president. And he ran out of luck the next year when this happened. And they voted in a new president that vowed that he would eliminate radical Islamic terrorism. But I just mentioned there's already been a few attacks just in the last week. It keeps on going. Well, let me just say this. Why is it that most of you know about 17 people in France and don't know about 2,000 in Nigeria? Here's my observation. Maybe I'm wrong. But they're just Africans, and the Western media doesn't care. They're just Christian Africans, and the media really doesn't care. Because it's an ongoing situation, and very few of you hear about it. I guess I take it more personally because I've been there, and I've worked with these people, and they're really brave Christians. They don't hide that they're Christians, even though 2,000 to 3,000 of them get killed in that territory every year. March of 2015, less than a year after the Pope calls for military action. In an unusually blunt endorsement of military action, the Vatican's top diplomat at the United Nations in Geneva has called for a coordinated international force to stop the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. He said the joint statement originated with Russia, which traditionally sees itself as a protector of Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. Well, if I understand things right, papal-led Christianity, all the world follows them, Revelation 13:3. They call for war. The U.S. and their allies pile in right away. Less than a year later, Russia and their allies say, we're in with you too at the UN. And the world then acts shocked when about 6 months later, Russia sent forces into Syria. Shouldn't have been shocked. The Vatican and Russia were already on record at the UN that that's what was coming. But when you know the prophecy, you can see what's coming in all these news reports, at least to a pretty good degree. Now, things haven't always gone smoothly. Both the United States and Russia have had special forces in Syria. And there was one day that there were 6 or 7, I forget exactly the number, 6 or 7 American special ops with a group of Kurds. And they came under attack by some Syrian forces with Russian forces with them. Now, they try really hard to avoid this. We had a showdown 2 or 3 days ago in Syria between some Americans and Russians, but the radio communications cleared it up. But on this one, the American special ops calls out and said, "Get those Russians to back off." Communications went back and forth, and the Russians chose not to back off. And when 6 or 7 American special forces come under fire, when things run according to military plan, that means air cover closes in. And over 200 Russians died in short order, attacking a couple Americans, 6, 7 Americans. You probably didn't hear much about that. A few of you may have heard about it. Putin says, "Oh, those must have been mercenaries wearing Russian uniforms." And the U.S., not wanting to have a conflict, said, "Oh, it must have been." Both sides dropped it. Hope nobody saw. Question. During the Crusades, you had different nations, when the Pope calls for war, you have different nations go to fight in the Middle East. Did they always play nice to each other there? The Christian nations? Nope. It's still the same. Hasn't changed much at all. And while all of this is happening, look at what the Huffington Post said. Pope Francis wants to be president of the world. If I'm right on Daniel 11, he ends up being the primary world leader. Then again, he's already pretty close to it. But shrewdly, methodically, and with a showman's flair, the soft-spoken 78-year-old Argentinian Jesuit priest named Pope Francis showed Thursday that he is running to become president of the planet. And they were ready to endorse him. Every time a radical form of Islam comes on the scene, it creates a holy war, and the papacy gains in power out of the deal. We're on the 3rd round. Then we had an immigration crisis in Europe, and I cannot blame the Muslims that were trying to flee out of North Africa and the Middle East. You wouldn't want to live there either with all the stuff going on. I don't think this wave can stop, said Sonia Licht of the International Center for Democratic Transition. The global north must be prepared that the global south is on the move, the entire global south. This is not just a problem for Europe, but for the whole world. You see, in the summer of 2015, as these immigrants started flowing into Europe, the politicians, mostly left-leaning politicians, came out and offered flowers as welcome. But they kept coming in larger and larger numbers, and they said, whoa, slow down. They kept coming. They said, stop. They kept coming. Oh, now the left-leaning politicians are struggling to stay in office, and the right-leaning politicians are gaining power across Europe. Anti-immigration, anti-Islam powers. But notice, we have a South pushing against the North, and about this time we have a U.S. campaign for president going on, 2016, 15 going into 16, right? We're right in the middle of one of them again. Well, the last two, this one and the last one, are both very interesting presidential campaigns, aren't they? During that campaign, Trump starts talking about building a wall on the southern border. The South is pushing against the North. In a Fox News event, a Hannity town hall meeting, Trump is there, and he's asked about radical Islam. He says, the point is radical Islam, want to do serious harm. We have to take them out. We have to take them out very, very swiftly and viciously if necessary. We've got to destroy the brand of jihad. Daniel 11, the king in the north strikes and goes out like a whirlwind. It sounds vicious and fast, doesn't it? When he said that, I thought, wow, that's right in line with the prophecy. Then during his inauguration, he said, we will reinforce old alliances and form new ones and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. And you'll remember the expectations from Daniel 11. The king of the south will push against the north, king of the north will call for war, and radical Islam will be destroyed. He's saying what the prophecy's saying, I believe. Look where Trump goes on his first foreign trip. Saudi Arabia, where the king of the south comes from. Israel, the one caught in the middle. And the Vatican, where the king of the north comes from. He's 3 for 3 of the players of Daniel 11. The visit to Saudi Arabia, he said, will include a truly historic gathering in Saudi Arabia with leaders from all across the Muslim world. We will begin to construct a new foundation of cooperation and support with our Muslim allies to combat extremism, terrorism, and violence. Notice, he's building a Muslim alliance to take down radical Islam. Daniel, Egypt and many countries are overthrown. Radical Islam goes down. Libya and Ethiopia, they follow the king of the north. There is an alliance out of the Middle East that supports papal-led Christianity. And he's out to build it up. And he leaves a Jewish man in charge of it with a Muslim young man. The crown prince of Saudi Arabia and the crown prince of the United States. You didn't know we had a crown prince. That's what the Atlantic called him. Because the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president. And they went outside of normal lines, built a friendship to try and change the Middle East based on a personal friendship. A Muslim and a Jewish guy trying to change the world through friendship. Interesting. Then President Trump announced that the U.S. will officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital and will move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Whoa, that stirred things up. Within a few days, there was a meeting in Turkey. Soleimani, you may have heard of him recently. Commander of the Al-Quds force says his nation is ready to support Palestinian forces in the Gaza Strip days after the U.S. recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. You need to understand some things. That's one of the most loaded paragraphs I've got on the screen. Soleimani is commander of the Al-Quds force. That's the Iranian Al-Quds force. Al-Quds is the city that the radical Muslims believe will be the world capital of all Islam. It is not in the nation of Iran. That's why their special forces, their elite forces trained to fight outside of Iran, are called the Quds Brigade or the Al-Quds Force. Now, he's ready to support Palestinian forces in Gaza Strip. That's loaded too. Iran is Shiite. The Palestinians in Gaza are Sunni. And they just agreed to support them and arm them. They've been doing it for a couple of years now. But here's the big thing. They're all ticked off because the United States has recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Why is that such a big deal? Because Al-Quds is the Muslim name for Jerusalem. How often have you seen that in the media? Oh, it's there if you're looking, but you really have to look hard to find it. Notice in Bloomberg article here, they talk about Al-Quds, they talk about Jerusalem, they don't tell you it's the same place. Now do you get an idea why this guy was considered so dangerous? Iran keeps saying they're going to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Why? Because they want to take Jerusalem to make it the capital of the world for Islam. Not Medina, not Mecca, They want Jerusalem as their world capital. Daniel said, who was going to get caught in the middle? Israel and Jerusalem. How can it be avoided now? I can't see Daniel missing. You get so close to a target, it gets harder and harder to miss. So I spoke a day after the head of Lebanon's Hezbollah movement, Hassan Nasrallah, called on all resistance groups in the region to come up with a unified strategy to take back Jerusalem. Iran's Quds Force, again, they don't identify him as the same. Iran's Quds Force operates beyond the country's borders and has fought Islamic State in Iraq and backed President Bashar Assad in Syria. Iran also supports proxies such as Hezbollah and Hamas that have warred against Israel, and also the Houthis in Yemen that fight against Saudi Arabia. They're stirring up the whole pot in the Middle East, the Al-Quds Force. Then the Saudi prince speaks out. Saudi Arabia's powerful crown prince Mohammed bin Salman has described Turkey as part of a triangle of evil of Islam, along with Iran and hardline Islamist groups. Now, you know who Turkey is and you know who Iran is. Islamist groups are all those non-nation actors who are groups of Muslims that are trying to establish a caliphate in Jerusalem. Turkey and Iran are too. So Islamists include Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, those kind of groups. The Saudi prince also accused Turkey of trying to reinstate the Islamic Caliphate, abolished nearly a century ago when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Now in the Atlantic, another article published about the same time, he goes on talking about this triangle of evil. Look at the title, Crown Prince, Iran's Supreme Leader makes Hitler look good. That's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia talking about another Muslim leader. In this triangle, they are trying to promote the idea that our duty as Muslims is to reestablish the caliphate, that the glory of Islam is in building an empire by force. We have no duty anymore to fight to spread Islam. But in the triangle of evil, they want to manipulate Muslims to tell them the duty as Muslims requires the establishment of a Muslim empire. I believe the Palestinians and the Israelis have the right to have their own land. That's an earth-shaking statement from a Muslim leader in the Middle East. But we have to have a peace agreement to assure the stability for everyone and to have normal relations. Well, Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman have been working on that one too. Except Mohammed bin Salman keeps doing things that cause trouble. All right. So we have a Muslim triangle of evil. Right after he says that Israelis have a right to exist and have their own land, there was gunfire in the Saudi palace. Shortly after. There was an assassination attempt on Mohammed bin Salman. He disappeared for a couple of weeks. Nobody saw him. The Iranians were openly celebrating the death of Mohammed bin Salman. And then Mohammed bin Salman showed back up with a greater hatred than ever for the evil triangle of radical Islam. He seems to be allergic to gunfire. May 14, 2018, the U.S. opens its embassy in Jerusalem, officially recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Oh boy. How about that one? There's a group in Israel that is ready to reestablish the temple and temple services basically at a moment's notice with a mobile temple. If they were to do that, it would be either the end of or the beginning of a holy war. It would be connected with a holy war, I promise you. But this was their temple shekel or their temple coin. Notice it has two faces on it. In the background is Cyrus the Great. After 70 years of captivity, he told the Israelites, or the Jews, that they could go back. Jerusalem was theirs again, and they then rebuilt the temple. May 14, 2018 was exactly 70 years to the day from the founding of the nation of Israel. After 70 years of statehood, Trump says Jerusalem is yours, and they believe they will rebuild the temple. Do things get interesting here? We've got Jewish people who want that spot. We have Muslims who want that spot. And Christianity has always looked at Jerusalem as the Holy Land. It's right in the middle, isn't it? Very much in the middle. Could Trump ever find himself in any trouble? I had somebody saying there might not be very many people here tonight because of the trial. I said, yeah, well, I think most of us know what's going to happen. Republicans and Democrats are going to argue with each other. All day, right? I didn't even have to look. I mean, I could predict that a long time ago. I said, yeah, more people might be interested in this than that. You know it's going to take a while to settle that one anyway, so you can come here. Suppose things go contrary to expectation and Trump gets found guilty and is taken out of office. Who becomes president? Michael Pence, who believes in rebuilding the temple on the Temple Mount. It could get even more interesting. Last summer, 7th July 2018, Trump warned Iran's President Rouhani, threaten us and you will suffer like few have ever suffered in history. Here was the Iranian response. It's a picture of Soleimani. Soleimani, yeah. Thank you, you say it better. Look at what happens. He claimed that he had over 1,000 cells in the United States. He's holding a radio. He's called in a strike on the White House. And the U.S. flag is falling, and the little piece of English on this poster says, "We will crush the USA under our feet." And if you want to know where you can get ongoing activities of what terrorism is happening around the world, this website gives you a daily and a weekly report. MEMRI, memory. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia was serious in its war against radical Islam. Saudi authorities are seeking the death penalty for 3 prominent clerics, TV preachers, testing the unwritten code that has kept the kingdom's rulers in power. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his father King Salman have jailed activists, businessmen, and government officials as part of their efforts to reshape Saudi society and economics. But Saudi clerics have long been a power unto themselves with fame and influence beyond that of others caught up in recent crackdowns. The jailed clerics are among Saudi Arabia's best known and most popular Sunni religious figures. Alleged crimes including spreading discord, incitement against the rule, and being active in the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a war to the death between moderate Islam and Brotherhood-related radical groups. These 3 men were found guilty. Last I knew, they had not yet been executed. However, the numbers of execution in Saudi Arabia have skyrocketed in the last year or two. Beheadings, mostly, and some stonings. Then, shortly afterwards, Jamal Khashoggi walks into the Saudi consulate in Turkey, and within a few minutes, he's dead. What was his big crime? He was a Muslim Brotherhood supporter. He was a lifelong friend of a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden. But you didn't hear that much in the American media. But it's still the case. The American media quoted Erdogan, the president of Turkey, who said it was such a terrible thing to kill a journalist, which it is. But on all those quotes of Erdogan about the evidence and what Erdogan is saying about how terrible it is, the American media rarely said anything about the thousands of Turkish journalists that are in jail and the hundreds of them that died before they got there. It's amazing what can happen when you only want to tell part of a story. And then there's this article, what would happen if Egypt or Saudi Arabia collapsed? Two nightmares are hovering over the Middle East, and they risk turning into devastating realities. One involves Saudi Arabia, the other Egypt. Both face possible collapse due to a mix of foreign meddling, internal contradictions, and most of all, their government's blind policies. I actually believe Saudi Arabia is probably going to survive. Don't guarantee that, but because they're aligning with the Vatican and the United States, I think that based on Daniel 11, they have a pretty good chance of survival. Egypt, Daniel says, goes down, which means it would have to radicalize. The last free election, the Muslim Brotherhood won. There are many Muslim Brotherhood supporters that are in prison right now. The president that was taken in the coup, Mohammed Morsi, and Mohammed Badia, the guide of the Brotherhood, along with several hundred other people, were found guilty in a one-afternoon trial of death, and given a death sentence, that neither they nor their attorneys were allowed to attend the trial. Sound like a fair trial to you? They have not been executed because if they did, Egypt would probably explode. But they're in prison. The current president, in September, went through a really bad problem because there was a contractor that fled Egypt, went to France, and posted a bunch of videos of the palaces he was building for El-Sisi, the president, and his generals. 30% of the Egyptians are living below the poverty line. I believe it's somewhere close to 50% of young adults are unemployed. That's a recipe for disaster. And when they saw that on YouTube, it started to boil in Egypt. And there was impromptu street demonstrations, and the military forces came out and cracked down on them instantly. People are forcibly disappeared. And groups of officers in street clothes would go out and they would come across a young person and say, "Give me your phone." No, they're beaten until they give it over. Open your phone, put your finger on it. And until they open it, they're beaten. If they open it and there is anything on there about those street demonstrations or that any sign that they've watched any of these videos, they might not be seen for a long time by anybody. Maybe ever. They were doing that down to elementary age school kids. What is your future when you do that? It's not good, is it? The anger level has to be intense. And in defending the building of these palaces, the prime minister, or the head of the parliament, I should probably prime minister, but head of parliament, I know was his title, said this, defending the government's position of building these palaces. Well, Hitler did it. Talk about blind policies. Use Hitler as a defense of what you're doing. I actually believe Egypt's not far away from it. Keep your eye on it. If I'm right, Egypt radicalizes. The Atlantic again, talking about the Pope's visit, this time to the United Arab Emirates. The meaning of the Pope's historic visit to the United Arab Emirates. What has changed in brief is the dual rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic State. The following analysis applies equally to the Emirates and to Saudi Arabia. Facing direct challenges, the Gulf states calculated that they could no longer appease Islamists and should instead crush them. That's why Khashoggi died. That is precisely what they have done both in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia. The institutional authorities of Islam and the political authorities with which they are aligned have just bought themselves an institutional ally, if not a theological one. Whether the alliance keeps the theological barbarians at bay is another question. If my understanding of Daniel 11 is correct, moderate Islam joins up with the Vatican, and they just talked about an alliance. They signed alliance papers. It's happening in front of us. Then, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, says China has a right to put these Muslims in concentration camps. Millions of them, somewhere between 1 and 2 million of them. Re-education camps. Why does the Saudi prince not care? Well, he says they're radicals. He doesn't like radicals. It's okay to kill them. It's okay to put them in prison. That's what he's doing. There is already a fight to the death within Islam between radical Islam and the more moderate branches. Neither of them is playing very nicely. But neither the king of the north have historically played nicely either. The king of the north or the king of the south. May of 2019, Iran's most prominent military leader has recently met Iraqi militias in Baghdad and told them to prepare for war, proxy war. The Guardian has learned. 2 senior intelligence sources said that Qasem Soleimani, leader of Iran's powerful Quds force, summoned the militias under Tehran's influence 3 weeks ago amid a heightened state of tension in the region. The move to mobilize Iran's regional allies is understood to have triggered fears in the U.S. that Washington's interests in the Middle East are facing a pressing threat. Donald Trump tweeted out, "If Iran wants to fight, that will be the official end of Iran. Never threaten the United States again." Here was the Iranian response. Several tankers were hit in the Persian Gulf. Airports were hit. Refineries were hit. Oil lines were hit. A U.S. drone was shot out of the air. And the president didn't do anything. Iran put out a picture. It's an interesting picture. Dome of the Rock. Where is that? Al-Quds, Jerusalem. The water is really a Palestinian headscarf. And you have Israeli and U.S. ships sinking and smoking. It says we drowned them all. If they're wanting to set up the world headquarters of Islam with the Al-Quds force in Jerusalem, why are they supporting the Sunni Palestinians? To get Al-Quds. That little picture tells you what's going on when you realize it's all about Jerusalem and they're using the Palestinians as pawns to get what they want. That's an Iranian picture. Then U.S.-backed forces are struggling to quell ISIS insurgency in Syria, Iraq. Despite Trump's repeated declaration of victory over the terror group, a new Pentagon report says ISIS is continuing to regroup. It's not gone. Israel and Hezbollah, man, they've been playing around the edges with a war, but really it's a war between Israel and Iran. In October, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. The Caliph. Actually, he'd been killed several times by both the United States and the Russians. They both claimed it multiple times, but this time he died. And they named a new Caliph. They call him the Professor. Is the King of the South finished? I don't believe so. We have time of the end caliphates, radical Islam coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we still have Turkey, Iran, and all these Islamist groups. And the worst case scenario is this expands and possibly they unite. I think it's going to get a little worse before it gets better because Egypt has not yet radicalized and fallen. December 31, the U.S. Embassy was attacked in Iraq by Iranian proxies. January 3, a U.S. airstrike near Baghdad's international airport killed Soleimani. The Defense Department said it killed Soleimani because he was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. It also accused Soleimani of approving the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad earlier this week. Soleimani led the paramilitary Revolutionary Guards Quds, or Jerusalem Force, one of the few reports that actually said what it was. So after his death, Iran was furious. Ayatollah Khamenei, Ali Khamenei, made a rare appearance at a meeting of the government's National Security Council to lay down the parameters for any retaliation. It must be direct and proportional attack on American interest, he said, openly carried out by Iranian forces themselves. Later that day, I was just walking into a presentation. I looked at a news webpage, Drudge Report, and that's what I saw. It's war. Iranian targets U.S. troops. Missiles fired at bases. Fierce revenge has begun. Iran starts second round of attacks. Each one of these is a different news report. U.S. bases in Iraq. Operation Martyr Soleimani is 3 waves just after midnight. Urgent meeting at the White House. Well, unfortunately, the later missiles that were launched weren't launched at the United States. It took down an airliner. We came really, really close to the war some of the radicals wanted. But Iran didn't kill or seriously wound any Americans. Oh yes, there were 11 Americans with concussions. Underground where those missiles hit. But thankfully, none were killed, because if they would have, it would have possibly spiraled out of control. Just 2 weeks ago, we came really, really close. Hezbollah has prepared for this moment for decades. Last week's Iranian missile attack on 2 Iraqi bases that host U.S. forces was Tehran's initial symbolic and overt response to Soleimani's death. The full response will unfold in the coming months and years and will likely feature Hezbollah in a starring role. It will be non-conventional warfare response. That was on the 14th. On the 19th, a Palestinian Authority daily calls for murder to stop Holocaust ceremony in Jerusalem. One shot, is their quote, will disrupt the Holocaust ceremony, and 1 dead body will cancel the ceremony. Which is a call for murder in the op-ed in official PA Daily, as over 40 world leaders gather in Jerusalem this week for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Pence will be there, Putin will be there, and many other world leaders. Pence also has a visit, I forget if it's on the way or the way back, with the Pope. And you have some radicals that are openly calling for an attack on this event in the Palestinian Authority newspaper. Today, Washington Free Beacon, Iran has spies across the U.S. Officials warn after Tehran posts a $3 million bounty on Trump. The bounty is the latest in a series of increasing direct threats by Tehran. It has renewed concerns about the Islamic Republic's vast terrorism network, which stretches into the continental United States. Where we stand at this moment, I'm not positive. I know we live in interesting times. My guess has been that this will continue to intensify until Egypt is overthrown, because the text says Egypt and many countries go down. And the king of the north will set himself up in or near Jerusalem, which tells me in all of this, Israel will probably be in trouble and need help. We're close. Romans says it this way: now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer than we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. I think it's time to get serious about Jesus. Some would say, well, Tim, are you sure this is all going to happen? Are you sure you're not going to be an embarrassment when it all goes wrong and you're wrong? I would just simply say this, folks. We've already had a third caliphate. The Pope has already declared war. That caliph has gone down, although I think it's going to get worse. It could be argued that Jesus could come at any time. And this is already fulfilled. So this is not something that would absolutely ever be wrong, because it can already be very well argued that it's already happened. I still think it's going to get worse, but I would suggest you not count on more time. Be ready to go for Jesus to come now. Now the good news. The part that escapes. These shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and Ammon. That's western Jordan. Daniel 12:1, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And the word escape and the word delivered are tied together in the Hebrew. They're the same base word. And so what you have, Edom, Moab, and Ammon are part of these people that are delivered, at least a part of them, and that's when Jesus rescues his people. That would indicate Edom, Moab, and Ammon have to somehow be connected with Jesus. Three-way split of Islam. Edom, Moab, and Ammon escape. Egypt, radical Islam goes down. Modern Islam follows papal-led Christianity. Now take a close look at this part. Everyone who's found written in the book. There's a parallel in Revelation. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life when they see the beast. Revelation, the whole world follows the beast except those who are in the Lamb's book of life. Edom, Moab, and Ammon don't follow. They're not overthrown, and they don't follow the king of the north. That means they have to be in the Lamb's book of life. This is a Muslim group. Thessalonians says, and they shall not escape, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. The only people who escape are those who are trusting in Jesus. Here it is in Hebrews. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? How do you escape? By trusting in Jesus. So let's take a look at a map. This is Davidic kingdom, the borders of David's kingdom, all right? Notice Edom, Moab, and Ammon were inside of David's kingdom. It was a part of the kingdom. When Jesus comes back, there are multiple verses that talk about Jesus restoring the Davidic kingdom. That would include Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Isn't that neat? Now, Amos 9. On that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, the Davidic kingdom, which has fallen down, and repair its damages, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. Edom is included with the Gentiles. Daniel says Edom, Moab, and Ammon escape. Joel 2:28. Man, it gets really good here. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. So just before Jesus comes, there's going to be a lot of dream and vision activities. And friends, in case you didn't know it, by the hundreds of thousands, Muslims in the Middle East are having dreams and visions leading them to follow Jesus as their Lord and Savior. I have a friend that for the last several years, I've been meeting with him at least once a year. He operates an underground network in Muslim countries that has somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Muslims that are following Jesus as their Savior and the Bible as their authority. That is not a church-sponsored network. But this man has an organization. He's a contractor, by the way. That's his day job. That's his cover for his night job. I want to tell you about these Muslims. They don't claim to be Christian. They say they're Muslims. They say, we're more Muslim than ever. You see, Muslim means surrendered to God. And so they say, we're more surrendered to God than we've ever been in our lives. In the Quran, it talks a lot about Jesus, Isa. We're followers of Isa as their Savior. In the Bible, it says there are a group of people, in the Quran, it says there are a group of people that are to be respected. They're called people of the book, the Bible. If they're true people of the book, they're to be respected. And so these people say, all right, we're those true people of the book. We're trusting Jesus as their Savior. We're following the book. They don't claim to be Christians because to be called a Christian in the Middle East means to be a follower of the Pope and a crusader. That's why if you become a Christian, you're put to death. It's back to the Crusades. These people are not claiming to be crusaders. They're followers of Isa in the book, Jesus. And they're getting away with it. It's fantastic. People are trusting Jesus. Let's see. If somebody's trusting Jesus and following the Bible as their authority, it sounds like my brother and sister in Christ, doesn't it? I don't care what you call yourself, what group you're affiliated with. If you're truly following Jesus in the Bible and you've learned to love other people, you're my brother and sister. I think this is fabulous. God is preparing his remnant. But did you just catch something here? Right before the coming of Jesus, there's going to be these dreams and visions. About 2/3 of Muslims that follow Jesus as their Lord and Savior have had a dream or a vision leading them to do so. I have talked to large numbers of people who had dreams and visions and are now followers of Jesus. Personally talked with them. If that's supposed to happen just before Jesus comes, heads up, it's happening. If Daniel 11, the third and final conflict, is supposed to be like a whirlwind right at the time of the end, and folks, it appears to be happening, heads up, it's time to be ready for Jesus. So what's a true Christian supposed to do? Well, you don't join the king of the south, but you're not too tempted to do that, most of you. You don't join the king of the north. That one you could be tempted to do. Because that's the power that has twice stopped the spread of radical Islam. The thing of it is, they've done it through bloodshed. Jesus said that we're supposed to do it through love. Both the north and the south are using force. The gospel spread when Christians were ready to die for Jesus. It stopped spreading when they started killing for him. If I was to walk up to you and put a gun to your head and say, convert or I'm going to kill you, you might say you're converted just to stay alive. But would it convert your heart or harden your heart? Do you see why Christians grow when they're willing to die for Jesus but not to kill for him? Did Jesus come to kill for people or die for them? Who's your leader? I hope it's Jesus. That's who I choose to follow. And so here's the deal. What's a Christian supposed to do? They'll take a stand in the middle. Love people on both sides. They will be hated by both sides. But eventually the king of the south goes down, then the king of the north goes down, and Jesus rescues his people that are caught in the middle. Where do I want to be? In the middle. And that's what this prophecy is for. It lets you know what to do. It keeps you from going to those dangerous extremes. So next, what happens next? And here's an amazing thing. So far, most of Daniel has been quite geopolitical. It's talking about political wars and all this kind of stuff, hasn't it? And these powers and how they're at play. All of a sudden, from this point on, it takes a very personal twist. It's as if God is saying, I'm going to get people's attention with what's going on, and then I'm going to prepare them personally for the coming of Jesus Christ. And so from here on out, we're going to keep following Daniel 11. We're going to verse by verse, and you'll be amazed at how it prepares you to live in these times and to be ready to meet Jesus Christ. Tidings from the east and the mark of the beast. That's our next presentation. Is verse 44. Daniel 11:44 is tidings from the east. Parallels mark of the beast in Revelation. All right. Thursday evening, after the second session, I'm going to give a half hour for question and answer time. I've already got a couple of questions that have been turned in before I even announced it. So I'll take written questions first with this size group. If you want your question answered, you better take advantage of written. Write it on the back of the envelope. If I run out of written questions, I will give time for people to raise their hands. But half hour cuts it off. We're done. All right? Now, presentation 5. If you put it on your response envelope, and number 5, and if you want to put a donation in there to help them out with their expenses, that's okay. Statement 1, Islam is the king of the south in Daniel 11 because it came from the southern part of the Roman Empire, invaded Israel from the south, and has fulfilled all aspects of the prophecy so far. If that makes sense, put a yes on it. Number 2, both the king of the north and the king of the south have persecuted God's people of faith. If that makes sense, put a yes on it. Number 3, radical Islam Egypt will be overthrown while moderate Islam Libya will follow after papal-led Christianity, the king of the north. Radical Islam goes down, moderate Islam follows papal-led Christianity. If you agree with it, yes. Disagree, no. Number 4, God has a people who will truly follow Jesus in the Bible. God is calling his people out from both Christianity and Islam to follow Jesus in the Bible. If you agree with that, yes. Disagree, no. To me, that's fabulous. God is bigger than our barriers. He doesn't look at our little groups. He looks at his people that are scattered all through them. I find that encouraging. All right. Number 5. Man, I hope the answer to this one is yes. I will follow Jesus and what the Bible teaches. That's my goal in whatever group you're in, that you will be following Jesus and what the Bible teaches. All right. Again, question and answer Thursday. Tidings from the East tomorrow night. Oh, if you have a friend that needs to hear this, tell them to come out here Wednesday at 5:30, but it will be a much shorter version. Anyway, there's also a video of just this presentation in the back. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I am so grateful that even in a crazy world, we know you love people. And Lord, help us to love people in every group. Help us to be tearing down walls and not building them. Help us to love everyone, even if they don't love us. Lord, thank you for giving a prophecy that we can know that we're really close to your coming and that we can get ready and love people in the readiness for your coming. In Jesus' name, amen.